Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Global Supply Chain Practice Head for Morgan Phillips Executive Search. Today I'm delighted to have with us Sanne Manders, COO of Flexport. Just a couple of words on Flexport, which is one of the fastest growing 3PL in the world. And in just 5 years, they have distinguished themselves as the leading software-powered freight forwarder, helping more than 15,000 companies deliver their goods to customers worldwide. Sanne joined Flexport in 2014. Very soon after the company's start. And as the Chief Operating Officer, he is responsible for operations, procurement, and carrier relations across all modes of transportation. Before Flexport, he was at BCG, the global management consulting firm, leading customer relations in logistics and the supply chain practice across worldwide assignments. He also sits on the advisory board of Port Excel, which is the accelerator of the Port of Rotterdam. Sanne, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
Super. So maybe let's start by talking a little bit about Flexport, giving some context to our audience, and maybe if you can share with us what is currently the main pain point that Flexport is solving, and how do you feel you're disrupting the freight and logistics industry?
Yeah, so Flexport is a freight forwarder and customs broker. And what freight forwarding and customs brokerage does is managing the complexity of global supply chains. If you're looking into supply chains, there are a lot of problems. First of all, it's an industry which is still lagging in technology adoption. I always make the joke, it's still pre-Netscape. And as a result, there's not that much structured data in the industry. And if you're lacking structured data, both the customer experience, which means visibility, transparency, can I just have a real-time view on my supply chain? That's missing. But what's also missing is a higher degree of automation, which basically reduces your cost to serve. It reduces human error. It just speeds up everything. So we're working basically on two things. One is our customer experience. So that's all about visibility, it's analytics. And we're talking about cost to serve. So reducing the cost of shipping, which doesn't mean the cost the cost of, let's say, the containerized transport. It is the cost of the coordination. If you're looking at freight forwarders, they charge roughly 20-25%. The leading players in the world, even 35% of margin to schedule that transaction, to coordinate that transaction. And a lot of that money goes into the inefficiency to make sure that the human to human, let's say, relay race keeps on running. And by bringing in data, you can actually replace that human to human relay race with a machine to machine, reducing human error and also reducing costs.
Yes, and basically, I think that brought us to the next question, and you gave a bit of context in terms of how the current freight forwarding industry works, which is it's still highly paper-based. A lot of coordination between different parties, a lot of coordination between different humans, of course. That leads to a lot of mistakes, and I think that's where, or can lead to a lot of mistakes or delays, and that's where you guys created a big stir when you started, and as well as now you're growing because you're offering that visibility that a lot of companies appreciate. But maybe if we can talk a little bit about digitalization, because I think it's a topic in every 3PL and in most supply chain companies. They're talking about it. Most manufacturers are talking about it. How long do you think that it will take the traditional players to catch up with you guys?
Yeah, that's a very hard question to answer. But let's take for a minute to step back. This is a very hard industry. Typically, if you're moving a product from a factory, let's say in China, to a customer in the US, there are between 7 and 15 parties involved. And then I'm not only talking about asset owners. I'm also talking about customs brokers, port authorities, talking about the insurance company, purchase order management, et cetera, right? So it's a complex network of a lot of different stakeholders. Those stakeholders all use different systems. They use different standards. So it's very hard to say like, oh yeah, let's just create a platform that aligns all those stakeholders, because all those stakeholders have worked for 200 years in a specific way. So by coming in and say like, we're we're going to do everything different, you're not solving it because all those vested interests are not going to change. So it's a hard industry, and it's a hard industry to change. So also to give, all the players that are out there and existing already for 50 to 200 years a lot of credibility, they managed all this complexity in a world where there was no internet. Right, so they have very strong processes. They have global cooperation models, et cetera, et cetera. But that comes at a cost, right? If you're looking at the top players in the world, they employ 50,000 people. Well, they have 2-3% market share. So if you want to get to a company that has 20% market share, you have to hire another 450,000 people, right? Not many companies have been successful. And honestly speaking, I think there are only 2 companies in the world that employ that many people. And I'm not sure whether that's successful because one of them is the Indian Railways. So you have to look at, how do I grow from an industry which is so fragmented but has inherently so much scale to an industry which is much more efficient, that can be, let's say, 10x the size, or a company that can be 10x the size with the same amount of people. And there are 2 ways to consolidate this industry. And what you've seen historically is consolidation. Well, this makes the problem only worse because all those companies that get together even have, different system requirements, different processes. It takes them ages to align those things. I know of one of the leading freight forwarders. They started implementing SAP in 2008, and somebody told me that they might be ready with their first version in 2018, right? We were founded in 2014, right? So the other approach to the same, and the reason is that because they have so many different systems, so many different operating companies that work differently, it's very hard to standardize even within that company. So the other approach is the technology approach, and basically starting greenfield and say like, okay, what it should look like, and build it from there. And of course, we believe in that technology approach, where historically the industry has believed in a consolidation approach.
And I mean, to add to your point, I think we've seen a lot of that, right? So, I mean, we've seen big acquisitions. We've seen TNT being acquired by FedEx on the express side. We've seen, DSV acquiring UTI, and there's been a lot of other, XPO has bought a few companies in the US. So I think there's been a lot of that consolidation model, which seems to still work to a certain extent. I think DSV, let's just name it as an example. It's seen as a successful model. And I guess it's the way the industry has run. It's not the way that you plan to do things. But I'm just wondering from let's say network perspective, right? If we had to speak, because also these guys, I mean, it's also deeply a network business, right? Freight forwarding is a network business. It's a relationship in terms of your provider's business, and this. Incumbents have solid big networks. How do you guys plan to reach that scale? Because that takes time. I mean, I don't know if technology can help, but obviously it's still a time game in which to build the capabilities.
Yeah, and exactly. And this is of course the race that we're running, and it comes back again. It comes back to your previous question on, when are these guys catching up? Well, they have a lot of advantage. They have a headway on us in terms of network, in terms of having built a mature company that has all the HR processes and stuff like that, right? They've been around for 100 years. We've been around for 4 years, so they have a lot of headways in terms of network experience. They also have a lot of headwinds. And that is, trying to change your legacy systems into modern technology. And this is the race we're running, right? We have to catch up on network and experience. They have to catch up on technology. We both have to work really hard. I don't think there will be a winner take all in this market. What I do think is, currently there are 100,000 forwarders in the world. The end game might be that there are 50 forwarders in the world, but out of those 50, yes, there will be definitely a couple of them. There are the established players that have reinvented themselves, and some are doing a really good job there. And we see them as good competition, and we have to catch up on the networks. So then getting back to networks, how do we deal with, let's say, that disadvantage? Well, there are a couple of things. Number one, you can move pretty fast. So we are a very adaptive company. We move very, very fast. So we're now 10 or 11 offices, which we opened in 4 years. Same for the warehousing footprint. We're moving very, very fast. Number two, you don't always have to use a fully owned model, right? You can also partner with companies in a way that they own the assets, but we define the processes. So that's, for instance, what we do on the trucking side. On the trucking side, we don't own any assets, but what we do own is the software that the assets are working through. So the trucking companies that we work together with, we bring a lot of value to them, and in return, they install our software. So all of a sudden, we have actually a lot of advantage in terms of cost to serve, and they have a lot of advantage because we bring them more business, but we give them also more visibility on what's coming. For instance, our trucking companies in LA know so many days out how many containers are coming there. We don't book them a day before. So you can actually create ways to collaborate with other parties that are so beneficial that you can grow your network quicker.
And I mean, if we had to think, a couple of years ahead, I don't know, 5 to 10 years ahead, and all this big mammoth organizations trying to digitalize, your Schenker, the DHLs, your Kuehne+Nagels, let's just name the top three, right? Once some of them or all of them will manage to do that, and I think Ryan Pedersen, your CEO, was mentioning at some point in TechCrunch that there's 25 freight forwarders. There's only 25 freight forwarders that do 1 billion in revenue a year or more from all those 100,000. So there's 25 that are big. So once the top three or some of these 25 will manage to get to that digital adoption, where do you see Flexport still having a unique selling proposition on them?
Yeah, it is a very good question, and it comes back. What is competitive advantage? And this assumes a world where competitive advantage is stagnant, right? Where you have to get up to a certain, let's say, minimum bar, and then everyone competes. And I honestly think that the interesting part of the future of this industry starts after digitization, right? Because you can only do advanced functionality if you've digitized, right? People talk about AI, people talk about blockchain. Honestly speaking, all these things are not relevant if you don't have digital data. So we're now going through this phase of digitizing data, making sure that the human-to-human relay race is structured in digital data. So it's a real digital transformation, which now helps for the customer experience. Over time will help for cost to serve, but but those things are things where others can catch up as well. But if you have that digital infrastructure, you can also start talking about optimization. Optimization currently in freight forwarding is run on spreadsheets, or it's run by judgment of people. There are not that many models running in the background running on big data. Well, then all of a sudden you open a whole Pandora box of optimization, right? Great example of that is, why do people use so much full container loads? Well, it's because they don't trust less than container loads. Well, less than container load is actually a better product because you can reduce working capital. You get much more equal flow in your supply chain. Oh, if you have much better processes, if you have better visibility, if customs holds are under control because you know much better what's going on, LCL all of a sudden becomes an attractive product to reduce working capital. Well, that's a great supply chain tool. Well, so that's the next phase, is optimization. And then there is a phase which is called autopilot, where actually the software is making most of the decisions as long as it's within the guardrails. So that actually means that a lot of logistics teams sitting at our customers will have a job which is not keeping the ship afloat, but thinking about the future. They can think about, how can I actually run my supply chain next year and in 5 years instead of firefighting for the whole day and reconciling spreadsheets. So the interesting part is actually yet still to come, and that will define competitive advantage in the future. Competitive advantage right now is a better user experience and a lower cost to serve.
And I want to ask you this question because it's been boggling me. And then also we had on the podcast the CEO of Haven. I don't know if you know Matt Tillman. So Haven is kind of like a software for automation in the shipping industry, and I think they have similar backers to yourselves. And really, Matt was saying that he's trying to build this software as a platform, kind of a solution where he will run it as AS. And I was wondering, because at Flexport you kind of took the decision. You have a wonderful software, which visibility tool, which you're giving for free, or mostly for free, right? And then you operate as a 3PL. Why didn't you choose the other way around, right? The other path around, where you become a software company and then do the rest for free?
Yeah, this is a very, very fundamental choice we made in the early days, and I can't talk for the choice that Matt at Haven made, but I can speak for the choice that we make. So, if you're looking at the freight forwarding industry, the root cause or the root of all the problems is that it's a paper-based industry. And if you move paper, then always the next party in the chain will have to read the message, interpret it, and then craft a message for the next party in the chain. So it remains that human-to-human relay race. When we were looking at it, this leads to a poor user experience, supply chains remaining in the dark, and it leads to high cost to serve. So we were like, if you put a layer on top of the industry, which basically says, now we're creating software where freight forwarders can work together, you're not solving the root cause of the industry, and that's the lack of structured data. So we said, we have to take the hard approach, and Paul Graham always calls that the SHLEP approach. We have to take the hard approach to this business, doing the hard work to really create something which is outstanding on the user experience and cost to serve. We're very happy that we took that choice, although it's the harder way to grow and the harder way to scale. Because if we're measuring our customer satisfaction, which we do in NPS, we have a 100-point lead over the industry. And I am sure if we would have done only a software-only approach, we would never have gotten there, because you get a little bit of that problem of garbage in, garbage out data if you're software-only. And we are actually if the data is not there, our teams create it. And therefore, you get actually high quality in, and as a result, high quality out. So this was a very, very fundamental choice in the early days. And is the future going to be like this? I don't know, because it might be that at some point in time, data is very, very good, and all asset owners and all parties in the chain deliver excellent data. Well, you might not need that managed service approach anymore. That said, and this is also one of the things that you mentioned before, this is a relationship business. So you also want to have human interfaces, right? It's like Facebook also didn't replace the human interface. It actually enhanced human relation. It actually enhanced the human relation. And that's also what we are doing. Our technology should enhance the human relationships so that, our account managers are focused on making your company better instead of running transactions. And that's the way how we look at it.
Yes. Yes. No, I mean, indeed. I mean, it definitely is the harder way. There's no doubt about that.
For sure.
So, you have picked the harder way. That being said, it obviously, as anything in life, right? Typically, good things are not done easily, and the rewards can be bigger if it's harder. And that kind of leads into the question that, with all this said and done, what are currently your biggest challenges when attracting new clients?
Yeah, so the question is, what does a new client? So how does a new client make a decision to switch freight forwarder? Typically is that they're not very happy with their current freight forwarder because they've been asking the same questions for many, many years. I want visibility, and preferably on an SKU level, right? I want real-time analytics. I want high-quality integrations, et cetera, et cetera. I want software to manage my supply chain. So honestly, that's what we deliver. We might not be answering all their questions, but we're answering a lot of questions that the current providers are not offering. So we have a lead there. We have a lead in what I say the customer experience. That said, you're asking me what is our biggest challenge? Well, we are growing every year. Well, we grew 2.5, 3x in the last 2 years. This year, we're expecting to grow 2x. Well, our company is 4 years old. So that actually means that I have to grow in new customers what I grew in the 3 years before. So the numbers are just becoming daunting, right? I just have to acquire a lot more new customers, which means having, the sales force in place, having the marketing in place, having the feet on the street, having the leads lined up for me. So it's just a numbers game, which makes it harder and harder. And that's just what every big company has. It becomes harder to grow the same percentage as the year before. We have to create a new Flexport every year, and that's the hardest thing. If I'm looking at, why do customers sometimes say no to us? And that's typically when we're competing for bigger businesses, and that's then against the incumbents, so the bigger forwarders in the world. Sometimes they don't dare yet. We are the new kid on the block, and it goes back to a little bit of the old wisdom. You've never been fired for hiring IBM. And that's sometimes, we're fighting against that, and, we have to establish our brand, and not everyone, dares to make the decision to work with us. That will become less and less of a problem, but we got to earn the trust. And bigger companies are trusting us. But not everybody will, some people will see it as a leap of faith, and you have to give them more time.
Yes, and also, also typically these things, it's kind of like a snowball effect. Once you catch one or two of the bigger boys, and then you deliver on your promises and you deliver on your contracts, and then that will trigger sometimes the floodgates to open, and you might not have enough capabilities to cater to everybody. But of course, that will also help you in terms of negotiating your rates, right? So that's the catch-22 that you have to catch up with, coming back to the network and the network expansion and the negotiation with the carriers, and the rates that you get with the volumes that you have currently versus the volumes that, if your volumes increase, obviously your rates get better as well.
What helps there, and that's also coming back a little bit on your question about the network, is also focus, right? I could pretend to be a global forwarder offering, every country on the planet. But the reality is that I say no to quite a bit of business because I know that I might not be the best partner there. I know what I'm very good at. I'm very good at the Trans-Pacific. I'm very good at the Transatlantic, and I'm pretty good at Asia to Europe. I also know where my competitive, how I procure and how competitive I am. If I look at the Trans-Pacific, for instance, we know that we are the number 18 right now in our containerized volume on the Trans-Pacific. Well, we were number 10,000 4 years ago. So, and around number 18, the procurement skills, the procurement curve starts flattening out. We might not be there at the procurement power of the number one, but we're not very far off, right? We can offset that by accepting lower margins. On the air side, I also know that I'm also ballpark in the same in the same league, and of course our investment in our own capacity in the last year, where we signed a long-term lease on the 747 on Hong Kong LA, has helped a lot in securing that capacity and becoming a bigger player.
Mm. And a little bit more specific questions related to Asia Pacific in particular, because you're dealing with a lot of different regulators and countries and customs and all of that. How are you able to assure logistics companies and partners that you're always up to date in terms of the complexity of all these custom regulatory compliance issues?
Yeah. So it's very clear if we don't know, right? If there are jurisdictions where we're not familiar with, it's easier not to accept the business than to go into the unknown. Right. So saying there's so much good business out there that it's relatively easy to say no to business where you're unsure or where, you think it smells. Right. So that's a very clear hard rule. We're under American jurisdiction. And the American jurisdiction in how to operate abroad is very strict in terms of FCPA, but also FMC. So we're taking that very seriously. I think the way we've approached it, and it's actually very funny if you look at the history of Flexport, we've hired our compliance people probably before anyone else. So our current, our hire number 2 was a compliance person. Our current compliance team, and that means our general counsel and our deputy general counsel, are both PayPal veterans, right? They know how to work in multiple jurisdictions around the world. And we've empowered them with very specific capabilities. So IATA capabilities, FMC capabilities, MOC, so for China capabilities. So we've covered all the modes of transportation with very specific know-how. And then have a world-class team that came from PayPal that is running basically our global compliance function. Then on the customs compliance, we have another world-class team that has cumulatively probably 100 years of experience or something like that in the leadership alone.
And talking about your latest round of funding, right, which you managed to secure 110 million from SF Express, which is the leading courier company in China. How do you plan to use the funds for the next couple of months?
Yeah, so there is for the next couple of months. I hope I do a little bit longer with that.
Maybe longer, yeah.
So yeah, it's a little bit longer than a couple of months. So it's not that the money that came from SF Express is not specifically to the partnership with SF Express, right? We see SF Express just like DST or a founders fund as one of our investors in the company. The advantage with SF Express is that they have also other ways to work with them. They're not only a financial backer, but they're also a strategic partner. So we deploy their capital just as if they are a financial backer, but we're also doing things together. So I mentioned already our freighter. They are one of our anchor clients on our freighter, right? There are many more plans in works with them around physical infrastructure because they're the biggest probably the biggest logistics player in Asia. So they have a lot of physical infrastructure that we can leverage, where we can leverage their capabilities. So in general, what do we do with money? Most of it goes into technology development, right? We don't subsidize freight. We don't believe that's people think that we subsidize freight. We've never done that. All our money goes into technology development and goes in building our infrastructure. So building a warehousing footprint, making an investment like in a freighter. The freighter in the first 2 months is not going to break even because you have to build up that capability. Things go wrong. You have to build up that volume. So strategic investment with a relatively short payback period on the infrastructure side, and then a lot of long-term investments on our technology side.
Mm. I'm just thinking a little bit from the journey from the beginning to now. I mean, you've come a long way. Flexport has come a long way, as you mentioned. It's some crazy numbers, really, from 10,000 to top 20 on certain trade lanes. If you were to reflect a little bit, what were some of them, if you were to share maybe with our audience who are thinking of embarking on an entrepreneurial journey or have their own startups, what are some of the key takeaways for you? What are some of the key lessons that you've learned in these 4 years?
Yeah, I would. The most important lesson is relentless focus on the customer. Right? You can invent a Swiss Army knife, but if nobody buys it, nobody buys it. Right? So it's better to focus on the customer and have something very specific for a smaller customer set and work from there. Like, not a Swiss Army knife, but a point solution and work from there. Listen to your customers, constant feedback loops, measuring customer success. That's lesson number one. You gotta sell before you earn the right to invest, right? And of course, it goes a little bit hand in hand. But don't think you get, let's say, I think we got in total right now what is it, $300 million? Don't think you get $300 million because you have a great plan, right? You have to show that the customer really wants to buy you. So it's a relentless focus on the customer. That's number one. Of course, building a team. That's probably that's also your primary interest in this industry, building the right teams, bringing a diverse set of capabilities together of builders, entrepreneurs, but also a lot of industry expertise. I already mentioned compliance. But it's also, if you're looking at the heads of our, modes of transportation, our head of air freight is the former chief operating officer of Delta Airlines Cargo. His name is Neil Jones Shah, right? My head of ocean freight is the former head of Kuehne Nagel's pricing department for the Trans-Pacific on ocean freight, Nereus Poskus. So bringing the right capabilities on board. And also putting that in a mix that they're all challenging each other, right? You don't want to rebuild the old industry. You want to have industry expertise, and then at the same time technologists and other people that challenge the status quo, and bring that all together into a mix that wants to create the future. So I would say that's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3 is also just luck and timing. We knew that at the moment we got into the market, when you looked at the ocean capacity on the TPEB, so the Trans-Pacific eastbound, there was a supply surplus. So prices were low. Everybody was treated equal. So the big players didn't have that much pricing power in favor. Currently, that's shifting towards a more balanced market, and with the sulfur regulation coming in 2020, we think actually it will be much more a market where there's more demand than supply. Well, we knew that this period that we were working in was 4 or 5 years. So you have to establish yourself in those 4 or 5 years as a big player, because when the market turns and it becomes a supply constrained market, then all of a sudden the big players do have much more bargaining power than the smaller ones. So we had this grace period, and we used it to grow up to the top 20. And we think actually we will be growing to the top, to close to number 10 within, let's say, the next 6 to 9 months.
Okay. Super.
On that lane, I'm not claiming any global victories. But it's the biggest trade lane in the world, right? So, achievement. We are. I think we are now roughly in the top 50 global, if you're looking at revenues.
Yes, in the span of 4 years. So again, putting things into context.
We still have a lot of work to do. Also, we're not close to the number 1.
Yes, and I'm happy that you mentioned and this is a recurring theme, right? You mentioned team, and you mentioned getting the right people on board as a key element for success. And if we had to dig a little bit deeper, because you did mention things like not wanting to reinvent and to do exactly the same as the industry, but at the same time kind of acquiring the capabilities and knowledge inherent to the industry, and then getting these people to kind of in a positive tension type of a way to challenge each other and work together and create something better. Are there some, basically when you do recruit, and you recruited and we're still recruiting for your leadership team into Flexport, your next level down from yourself, are there certain attributes or characteristics that you tend to look even more specifically?
Yeah, and those attributes are also changing over time. Where in the early days we wanted to have just problem-solving skills, people that just liked the problem of solving a puzzle and went the extra mile to solve it. Where now you also want to have leadership and managerial skills. If I look right now on what I'm looking for, of course, problem-solving is still high on my list, right? Because if you don't look for problem-solving skills, you have to risk that you're not challenging the status quo. Industry experience, depending on the role, but I would say, let's say in 50% of all roles that we hire for, you need industry experience. For the other 50%, you probably need a functional expertise. So, for instance, my head of pricing, she didn't come from the from the industry, but she came from a pricing background. And she dealt with very similar problems in a very different industry. So she brings a lot of capabilities there. Collaboration. The company is by now close to 800 people, so you know how you need to manage people and how to set them up for collaboration. Very important characteristic. And I would say the last one, it's an adaptive mindset, embracing change. What you see with people that come from bigger established companies is that they think in fixed patterns. That when they're heading a department right now, they should head that department forever or head a bigger department. Well, we're changing the organization structure of the company every year, almost by design. Just because we want people to have that adaptive mindset. The world is changing very quickly. We have to change very quickly as well. And so don't get stuck into your patterns. Don't try to defend your empire. Try to constructively basically destroy everything every year and build it up from scratch. Because I don't, if I look at at BCG, probably I've seen 400 companies in my life, the difference between good companies or bad companies and great companies is not the problems they have. They all have the same problems. It's the willingness to address them. And the willingness to address them is to embrace the change.
Oh, that's an excellent point. And I mean, this kind of applies. And again, we're dealing with all sorts of companies ourselves. And probably, I don't know if I've seen 400 companies, but we've seen quite a fair bit as well. And I could not agree more that in the world that we live in, which basically is in constant change and constant adaptation mode, unless you have that flexibility, versatility, and desire really to change, you're in deep trouble. And in reality, most companies don't have it. And the more established they are, I like the expression, right? The people have built their kingdoms. They want to protect those kingdoms, and that just doesn't work. Interesting. If you have that, if you have it almost as a culture in Flexport of positive destruction and rebuilding every year, I think it kind of forces people to get into that mindset. And if I'm to use an analogy, because I've been here personally for 10 years in Singapore. And when I came in Singapore, I was shocked at and maybe you've been to Singapore, and it's Asia in general. It's a shocking rhythm of development, which I was not used to from Europe. But now after having lived here for 10 years, it seems like natural. And when I go back to Europe, it seems so slow, right? So after a while, if you kind of inculcate this culture, it helps people to get used to it. And then the new blood that comes into the organization just takes it as the new reality. So you've kind of created this vehicle that in itself, this is to me, can be a unique selling proposition, right? Your culture is a unique selling proposition if it's done right.
Yeah. And it's also something that is very hard to keep going. We are now 4 years old. You hired people in the early days that scaled tremendously and have brought a lot to the company. And at some point, they get stuck in their ways. What do? Right? Are you going to say like, hey, the party is over? Or are you going to say like, hey, we have to redefine your role? These are hard conversations. But those conversations you have to have all the time because if you lose your adaptability, you can't move fast anymore, and then you have to risk that you become one of the established players, and that's as Jeff Bezos always says, it's always day one, right? It's never day two; it's always day one.
Yes. And I mean this. Just to add on again from our angle, what I'm seeing personally again and again is also culture is hard to maintain for sure. You've got to constantly keep yourself on the toes when you're hiring people, right? Not to become complacent, right? So hiring still is number one focus of the CEO of the leadership team. But again, if you manage to do that consistently, and very few do actually, because they fall into this trap of being complacent and they're number one or whatever. But if you manage to do it, culture is so hard to replicate. Your competitors might replicate your product if you're a manufacturer, might replicate even your software at a certain, but they cannot replicate culture. This is the hardest thing to replicate. So that's why it's so important.
Yeah, for us, what's the cornerstone of there are two cornerstones of our culture that are hard to replicate. It's that fast moving, that adaptability, I think that's very hard to replicate, especially in an incumbent, right? If you ask your engineers in an incumbent to show up with a suit and a tie every day, I'm not sure whether you're going to get the best engineers, right? So that's. We want to have that culture of moving fast. That means breaking stuff. You move so fast that you're breaking stuff, and that's okay, because if you didn't break stuff, you didn't try anything. So that's a part of our culture, a very important cornerstone. The other part of our culture is, and that's our value number one, it's empower the customer. And we've even designed our whole organization towards the customer, where you see in most of the companies that we're competing with, they have a sales department, they have an operations department, or maybe even an ocean operations, an air operations, a customs, a trucking. And what we've said is, we have to tilt this towards the customer. So we have for every customer a key account management team, we call it the squad, that has all the functional capabilities in it. It has sales, account management, operations, and customs. So in that little team, anyone can serve the customer. Anyone can answer the customer's questions, unless it gets extremely specific. But for 95% of all the questions, you get the answer from the first person you have on the telephone, instead of that you're getting passed on 15 times, et cetera, et cetera. So tilting that organization model, tilting it 90 degrees towards the customer, is very hard for others to replicate, because they've been set in their ways for many, many years. They want to keep it run functionally. All these functional silos have their own KPIs. They're not necessarily aligned. Sales wants to sell as much as possible, operations as cheap as possible. We have said no. They're all in cross-functional teams, reporting basically to the customer and having one goal in mind, and that's Net Promoter Score, customer satisfaction. And that aligns the incentives towards a customer. And that's our second cornerstone of our culture.
How do you, because you mentioned about this, and actually you got me really intrigued, Net Promoter Score. And it's actually something that I don't remember any other 3PL that I've dealt with even having this as a KPI. How do you measure it? Tell us a little bit about it. I know from typically it's from technology companies, or from e-commerce, or from media companies. But tell us a little bit, how do you use it at Flexport?
Yep. So there is no perfect customer satisfaction index or score, right? So you have to use multiple, more like surveys, etc. But no customer wants to fill a survey very often. So what we said is, we need to have this simple pulse check that we understand what does the customer think at any moment in time. So Net Promoter Score is a great way to do that. And what Net Promoter Score does is actually it asks one question, and it's like, how likely would you recommend Flexport to somebody else? And you can score that a 0 to a 10, which means that a 9 and a 10 is a promoter. A 0 to 6 is a detractor. They don't like it. They wouldn't recommend you. And a 7 and an 8 is what they call a passive. So if you summarize all the 9s and the 10s, and you detract the 0s to the 6 and divide it by the total, you get what they call the Net Promoter Score. This is a score which goes between minus 100 and plus 100. And the standard of excellence is set at 50. So everything above 50 is considered excellent. We've set our internal goal at the standard of excellence. We need to be 50 plus. And the reality is that we're roughly, it depends a little bit on the week, and we're, measuring it all the time, but it's always high 50s, mid 60s. Somewhere there in between is our Net Promoter Score. We measure it by key stakeholder, whether you are somebody who's working in the warehouse, whether you are paying our bills, or whether you're a primary stakeholder or a CFO, we're measuring that all. The reality is all above 50, and that's very good. So then how do you get the data for the rest of the industry? That's a little bit harder, right? I know there's one other forwarder that actually internally measures Net Promoter Score. We have a few people working from there with us, so we know what their Net Promoter Score is. And there are some data out there from neutral platforms that measure Net Promoter Score. They say that the industry is at roughly minus 35, and the best in class.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. No, people are not very happy typically with the full.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
We even had a tagline at some points for our online marketing, which was, "Yes, you can love your freight forwarder," because that's so uncommon, right? And then the best in class players, they're around 0. So we say, we have a 50-point lead over the best in class players, 100 over the average industry. that's also the reason why why we can double our customer count every year, because, the virality of that, people just tell each other, right? They start recommending us to others.
It's tremendous. I mean, I'm very happy that you shared this, because this is to me, I've never come across it. So I'll ask you separately who's the other freight forwarder, but it's definitely, I mean, it's obviously this is a services industry, and this should be a priority for most companies, or for all companies. It's just that interestingly enough, you're the first one that I've come across using it. So way to go from my perspective. And if I'm to shift a little bit the question, and we're drawing the close to our podcast, but you've had yourself personally a very interesting career, because you worked for many years as a consultant, right, at BCG, in the shipping and logistics industry, and then obviously you ended up at Flexport. How did that happen? Did you know Ryan from before, or what's the history behind?
Yeah, the story is actually very simple. So Ryan and I went to school together. We went to Columbia Business School back in 2008. So that's how we got to know each other. And we became friends there. And we even started a business together then, which was in a totally unrelated space. But we got to know each other really well. And what we did know is that we have very complementary skill sets. And as a result, that we empower each other. We never step on each other's toes, because Ryan is at other things excellent than I am, and I could never be Ryan, and Ryan could never be Sanne, right? So when Ryan was really at the early days of Flexport, and he was in Y Combinator, the startup accelerator, we were chatting about it, and I told him, hey, I actually do have a lot of experience about this, because I never talked about BCG, because it's always, it's confidential. You can't talk about your customers. But I know a lot about this industry. So can I help you a little bit? Because I think this is, I've been looking at this industry, and this needs a massive, massive transformation, digital transformation. So I know actually probably to a certain extent what to do here. So I started helping him out on the side, and at some point took a leave of absence, and turned that leave of absence into joining Ryan, because I actually flew out to San Francisco, and the deal was, I'll help you at Flexport, but you have to show me San Francisco or Silicon Valley to get inspired. And we worked like dogs for weeks on the business. And then at some point he told me, it would be crazy to let you go. We have to do this together. He didn't have to convince me at that moment in time anymore. I was like, I have to put my money where my mouth is, and get out of the advisory role and do it myself. A lot of people thought that was crazy, because I was very close to the partner position at BCG. But it's I was like, this is too good of proving yourself that what you're preaching you have to do, and it's probably the harder way to do it, but it's also the more fun way to do it, and that's still how I think about it. It's the harder but much more fun way to do it.
Very interesting story, yeah. And tell us, because I've had on the podcast a few board members and a few very senior executives, actually from established companies, as well as companies like yourself, which have come a long way in a very short span, and that there seems to be a pattern of people coming from a consulting background, whether it's external or internal. Did that play a part? Do you feel that played a part in your success? And how? I mean, how do you think it exposed you to something else, maybe?
Oh, absolutely. And, if I would do everything all again, I would do the consulting track again. Because I think consulting teaches you three things. Number one, you see a lot of different companies, and you see why companies are successful and why they're not successful. That's number one. Number two, I worked specifically in supply chain and logistics a lot. So I also got a lot of domain expertise out of it, not by doing it, but by observing it and at all levels of the company, right? I reorganized distribution centers, but I also spent time in boardrooms and even, connected those two, right? Because sometimes the problem of a boardroom is actually a problem on the work floor, and you have to connect those things. The third thing is it's just a career accelerator. You see so much. The training is so good. You're going every 3 months or every 6 months through a total new experience. That is just setting you up for accumulating a lot of experience in a very short period of time. Well, my short period of time in the end became 12 years, but I enjoyed every year of those 12 years, and I learned every year a ton there. So I think it makes you very well rounded. The part which is different is operating a business, right? Operating a business in terms of, let's say, being a people leader. At BCG, they also gave me a lot of exposure to that. Of course, you're managing your own teams, but I also had other roles in career development, which is more people management. But it is very different to operate a real business than a consulting business. In that sense, I got a soft landing because when we started, we were just a few people, which just looked very much like a consulting team. And by now, and it was the intellectual challenge of a consulting team. How are we going to actually do this? We got this bag of money and we have a great idea. How are we going to actually do it? And learn over time. Now we're 800 people, but I also got the luxury that I can actually hire experienced people leaders that help me managing the business. And in the last 4 years, I also learned a ton on people management.
Final question: If you were to give an advice to somebody that wants to, young graduate of a university, and maybe they have this, and I think in recent times it's become kind of a dream, and not a dream, an exciting career in some ways, to join a startup or start a startup, or I don't know, become an entrepreneur. Becoming an entrepreneur has become much more sexy than it ever used to be, and it's I think people fail to realize that it's super hard. So if you were to give an advice to somebody either wanting to join a startup or wanting to set up something on their own, what would that be?
Yeah, well, starting on your own, keep in mind it's not sexy. It's very, very hard work and a lot of existential questions in the beginning. At some point, it becomes a real business, and then you de-risk it, and and the existential questions disappear. But it's a hard journey, right? It's a very hard journey. It's much harder than joining a company, I have to say. And, they always said that at BCG that you had to be, on top of your game, and it's a high performance culture, which it absolutely is. But starting your own business is asking a little bit more from you than that even. So it's not glamorous. It's just hard work and persistence. Joining, it depends on the stage of the company, right? If you are join an early stage company, the interesting thing is that you can do, your role is very wide and undefined, and you can, learn where you want to add value and grow into different roles. If you join a little bit later stage, then it's more stable. There are more managers in place that can actually teach you things. You get a more dedicated role. So, but still you have the advantage of a startup that you can rotate quickly. It's fast moving. So you learn a ton. You learn much more than at an established company where you maybe by definition or by, people operations practices have to stay so many years in a job before you can actually think about the next thing. So it's a super interesting, I almost call it an MBA, right? Joining a startup is almost an MBA because you get exposed to so many different things. So yes, I would highly recommend a lot of people to start, not to join a startup. To start, they have to think twice. Because it's also, you need to think how you're going to win. And very often experience in the domain, or experience in managing a business in general is necessary to be successful. You always hear the stories of entrepreneurs that just started out of school. But if you're looking at the reality, it's the more seasoned people in general that have successful businesses.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that the issue has been Facebook, really. It just... I mean, there's one or two of these stories, right, which happen one in a million startups, and then people look at it and say, yeah, if you could do it, so can I. I mean, yes, in theory you can, but the reality of the numbers and the probability is against you. And 99% of the startups do fail, or 90, anyways, most of them fail. So and there is a curve that I think I saw one just the other week, in terms of there's a high probability that people between 30 to 40 years old that have a level of experience and working years can make it as entrepreneurs, rather than immediately after school, just because they have some life experience and practical experience under their belt. Thank you for kind of reinforcing that point.
Yeah, the only thing is nice is if you're just out of school, is that you don't have any commitments, right? People at that moment in time don't have a house. They're typically not married. They don't have kids, right? So it's so your opportunity cost at that moment in time are very low. So you have more time to experiment. Where people that have already had a couple of jobs, their opportunity cost of starting a business is higher. It might also be a self-selection. That's why they maybe have better plans. Otherwise, they don't do it. So they start with better plans. And on top of that, they have more experience. So if things go south or go north, to actually manage that trajectory.
Well, Sanne, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us, sharing with us, and basically imparting some of the trenchy stories that you've had at Flexport. We wish you a lot of continued growth, right? Continued growth and development, and we will be watching Flexport and its growth further, and hopefully we'll catch you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me.
My pleasure. Catch you soon.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to follow us on radopalamario.com/podcast for all the show notes, links, and extra tips covered in the interview. Make sure also to subscribe to our emailing list to get the news in the nick of time. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes or Stitcher and you like what we do, please kindly review and give us 5 stars so we can keep the energy flowing and get more people to find out about our podcast. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me to stay tuned for our latest articles as well as future guests for the podcast. And if you have any suggestions or any other idea, please feel free to write to me. I respond to all. And also, please make sure not to miss our next episode, where we will be having a few other C-level and top leaders in supply chain joining us. Stay tuned.